one of my main concerns really is that as this level of spending persists for these kinds of purposes, there is a risk that you have flare-ups, such as the one that we saw in Knowsley.
Why is asylum-related spending so high?
Well, when you're looking at the cost of asylum related expenditure by the UK government, a huge amount of those costs are associated with housing small groups migrants in hotels. My report puts that provides a midpoint estimate for the whole year in the region of 2.2 billion. And just to put that in perspective, that's 3.5 times higher than the UK government's investment in homelessness, which is in the region of 630 million. And that actually outweighs the entire funding when it comes to round two of the Levelling Up Fund, which was 2.1 billion. So when people hear those comparisons, I think that they'll be particularly disappointed when it comes to the amount of spending that the government is doing.
The argument was put to us on this programme a while ago that the problem the government have is that if they suddenly invest lots of money in processing asylum claims, by the very nature of them, they'll be accepting more and more asylum claims because they're processing more. So the overall number of people getting asylum will rise, and that might be politically unacceptable for them. So the obvious solution to this is to spend more money to get the list down, which will save money in the medium term, is not a politically acceptable one.
No, it wouldn't be. I think that it's very clear that the government's view is in terms of our asylum system, it needs to be tighter, it needs to be streamlined, and that what it wants to do, it wants to tighten the acceptance rates. So I think that you're correct there. That wouldn't be politically palatable for the UK government.
What about this thing, the story of the Times today? £500,000 a day on empty beds, 5,000 beds reserved for migrants. Presumably, what they can't afford to have is one area suddenly being overwhelmed by numbers, and therefore they need to have places to house them. But is that a reasonable use of money to keep these beds on standby?
Well, I think that whether or not we think it's reasonable or not, I think it's hugely problematic that the fact that the government, I think that according to the Times, it's £500,000 a day in terms of maintaining this buffer system. And I think that the main, one of my main concerns really is that as this level of spending persists for these kinds of purposes, there is a risk that you have flare-ups, such as the one that we saw in Knowsley earlier in the year. So I think that what the government really needs to do is to get a grip of the problem. It's trying to do that through the illegal migration bill, but there's obviously issues there with the level of judicial interventions that we've seen in the government's immigration and asylum policy. But what it really needs to do, it needs to help to drive down that expenditure. Now, of course, one way of doing that is diversifying the kind of accommodation provided to small boats migrants. We've seen the introduction of barges and the use of disused military facilities. But the issue there's something that I mentioned in the new report that I've authored for Policy Exchange, is that many of those local communities are not necessarily happy with those relocation schemes. And quite often what you're seeing now is that the Conservative government is increasingly at odds with their local parties in those parts of the country.
Yeah, the problem of NIMBYism is a curse in all
Indeed.
sorts of areas. Housing is one, and migrant housing is part of that.